They won't say it. They can't say it. But deep down, they know they hurt you. The avoidant may never form the words, "I'm sorry," but their silence, their distance, their defenses are the very confessions they'll never make out loud. Let's talk about apologies. Not the ones you hear, but the ones you'll never receive. Because when it comes to avoidant partners, their entire nervous system is built not for admitting fault, but for survival. An apology requires vulnerability. It requires opening a wound and saying, "Yes, I caused pain. Yes, I hold responsibility." For most people, that feels human. For the avoidant, it feels life-threatening. To understand why they withhold apologies, you have to see the invisible wiring beneath their behavior. Avoidants grew up in environments where emotional needs were either minimized, mocked, or simply ignored. They learned quickly, need less, feel less, show less, and maybe I'll survive. So when they enter adulthood, carrying a heart they don't fully trust, apologizing becomes more than just uncomfortable. It becomes dangerous. Because to say "I'm sorry" means, I acknowledge your importance. I acknowledge I could lose you. I acknowledge that my actions caused harm. And those words feel like chains to the avoidant. Chains that lock them into intimacy. Chains that tie them to accountability. Chains that whisper, "You are not fully in control." And control is everything to the avoidant. Think back to moments in your relationship. Maybe they pulled away right when you reached out. Maybe they said something sharp, dismissive, or even cruel. You waited. You longed for repair. You hoped they'd circle back with tenderness. But instead, silence filled the room. That silence wasn't just avoidance. It was their version of an apology. Twisted, silent, but in their world, walking away feels safer than leaning in. Here's what's hidden in the apologies you'll never hear. They won't say, "I'm sorry I made you feel invisible." But the truth? They know they did. They won't say, "I'm sorry I froze when you needed me most." But they remember the look on your face. They won't say, "I'm sorry I turned my back on intimacy." But somewhere inside, they know what they ran from. Avoidants are haunted by these unspoken apologies, even if they'd rather die than admit it. Why won't they say the words out loud? Because apologies force closeness. They require sitting with someone else's pain. And for the avoidant, that's unbearable. To them, closeness is a battlefield. Every step toward you feels like stepping into danger. Their nervous system screams, "Pull away. Protect yourself." Distance equals safety. So while you're waiting for repair, they're busy patching up their own sense of control. Let's go deeper. An apology also means admitting imperfection. And for the avoidant, imperfection equals unworthiness. Growing up, many avoidants felt that love was conditional. If I perform, I'm accepted. If I fail, I'm abandoned. So admitting fault in adulthood doesn't just feel like humility. It feels like annihilation. It taps into the old terror. If I admit I hurt you, you'll leave. You'll decide I'm not worth staying for. And paradoxically, in trying to protect themselves from abandonment, they create the very distance that guarantees it. So the apologies never come. Instead, you get a distracted stare, a sudden shift to talking about work, a joke to lighten the tension, or simply a locked door and a wall of silence. And each of these actions whispers the same thing. I can't face my own guilt. I can't face your pain. So I'll pretend neither exists. But here's the part they'll never say out loud. They do feel sorry, sometimes more deeply than you'd ever imagine. In the quiet of the night, they remember the way you cried, the way your voice cracked, the way your shoulders slumped. And for a moment, a flash of regret pierces through their armor. But instead of rushing to repair, they bury it. They bury it under work, under hobbies, under coldness, under distance. And to you, it looks like indifference. But deep inside, it's guilt disguised as silence. Here's the paradox. The avoidant fears apologizing because it makes them feel trapped. But the very apology they withhold is the bridge that could have saved the relationship. The words, "I'm sorry," could have healed wounds, could have restored connection, could have built trust. But because those words never come, the cracks widen, the trust breaks, and the bond erodes. Avoidants often realize this too late. By the time the guilt becomes unbearable, the relationship is already gone. And that's when they feel the full weight of the apologies they never gave. So if you've been with an avoidant and you've waited endlessly for their apology, let me tell you this. Their silence was never proof you didn't matter. It was proof of their own terror, their own shame, their own inability to face the intimacy that repair demands. You wanted words. You deserved words. But what you got instead was a silence heavy with things unsaid. And maybe the greatest apology you'll never hear is the quiet ache inside them that says, "I wish I had been brave enough to love you better." If you listen closely, the avoidant is always apologizing, not with words, not with "I'm sorry," but with patterns, with contradictions, with the way they move in and out of your life. You see, silence itself becomes a kind of language, one they mastered long before you ever met them. When they disappear for hours after an argument, that's their apology. It doesn't sound like repair, but in their world, withdrawing is how they manage the guilt they can't name. When they suddenly show up with a small act of kindness, fixing something around the house, bringing you coffee, sending a random text that feels out of character, that's their apology. But because they can't say the words, the gesture feels hollow, incomplete. You're left wondering, why can't they just say it? Why can't they just be honest? And the truth is, honesty feels like exposure, like a wound being ripped open. For them, vulnerability equals danger. And so the apology gets twisted, encoded, hidden in behaviors instead of spoken aloud. Imagine the little boy who cried once and was told, "Stop being weak." Or the little girl who asked for comfort and was met with silence. Those children grew into adults who carry shame around their needs. And when they hurt someone they love, they don't know how to repair. Because repair requires staying in the discomfort, sitting with another person's sadness, admitting fault without collapsing. The avoidant never learned how to stay. They only learned how to run. So every time you waited for words, that never came. You weren't hearing their indifference. You were hearing their fear. But here's what's heartbreaking. Even though the avoidant never apologizes, they do notice. They notice the way your energy shifts. They notice the distance growing between you. They notice your laughter fading. And deep inside, they wish they could undo it. But wishing is different from doing. And for the avoidant, doing feels impossible. Because to act on that wish, to turn to you and say, "I'm sorry I shut you out," would mean risking rejection. And rejection is the ghost that haunts them most. They would rather lose you in silence than risk losing you in vulnerability. So you get the silence every time. But silence doesn't erase guilt. That guilt festers. It lingers in the back of their mind. It keeps them awake at night. They replay the arguments. They remember the look on your face. They feel the sting of their own coldness. But instead of saying, "I regret what I did," they bury it. They bury it in distractions, work, hobbies, scrolling endlessly, drinking, anything that dulls the ache. And the irony? The more they avoid the apology, the more the guilt grows. It becomes a shadow, that follows them everywhere. You may think they don't care, that they sleep peacefully while you toss and turn, that they've forgotten the pain they caused. But the truth? Avoidants carry unspoken guilt, like a weight tied to their chest. It shows up when they hesitate before reaching out. It shows up when they linger on your social media. It shows up in the way they circle back, months, even years later, with a casual, "Hey, how have you been?" That's not just curiosity. That's guilt in disguise. That's an unfinished apology, trying to find its way to you, without the vulnerability of words. Here's the part you need to hear. The lack of apology was never a reflection of your worth. It was never proof that you didn't deserve repair. It was proof of how much their shame owned them. Proof of how terrified they are of being truly seen. Because to say "I'm sorry" would mean you see their flaws. And to them, flaws equal rejection. So instead of giving you the healing you needed, they protect themselves. And in doing so, they wound you deeper. You might wonder, do they ever regret not apologizing? The answer is yes. But regret for the avoidant doesn't look like confession. It looks like distance. It looks like circling back long after the moment has passed. It looks like unfinished words stuck in their throat. By the time they realize the cost, it's often too late, because the apology you needed was in the moment, not years later, not when the relationship has already collapsed. And that's the hidden tragedy of loving an avoidant. Their fear of closeness robs them of the very thing that could have kept love alive. So what do you do with apologies you'll never hear? You stop waiting. You stop holding your breath for words that may never come. You stop tying your healing to someone else's silence. Because the truth is, you don't need their apology to validate your pain. Your pain was real. Your disappointment was real. Your loneliness was real. And their silence, that was real too. But silence doesn't define you. It defines them. The avoidant may never say, "I'm sorry," but let their absence of words teach you something. Teach you what you deserve. Teach you what you will no longer accept. Teach you that real love includes repair. Because the love you're worthy of doesn't hide behind silence. It leans in. It takes responsibility. It chooses healing over pride. And if the avoidant couldn't give you that, that's not your failure. That's the apology they owe themselves. The one they'll keep running from, long after you've stopped waiting. There's a cruel paradox in the avoidant's silence. The more they avoid apologizing, the more love they secretly feel. It sounds backwards, but for the avoidant, the intensity of their emotions often creates the freeze. They care so much that they can't risk failing in front of you. So instead of fumbling through words like, "I'm sorry I hurt you," they withdraw. They retreat into safety. They choose silence over stumbling. But silence feels like indifference. And to you, it lands like rejection. Think about the last time you fought. You waited for them to bridge the gap, for them to soften, to reach across, to take your hand. Instead, they folded their arms. They looked away. They left the room. And in that moment, you didn't just lose their words. You lost connection. The lack of apology didn't just sting. It created a canyon between you, a canyon that widened every time the silence stretched on. But what you couldn't see was the storm raging inside them, their chest tight, their mind racing, their guilt burning hot. They wanted to apologize. They wanted to say, "I know I shut you out. I know I made you feel alone. And I hate that I did." But in their world, saying that feels like handing you a weapon. Because if they admit their fault, they fear you'll use it against them. You'll see them as weak. You'll turn away. So instead of speaking truth, they choose armor. Armor that looks like coldness. Armor that looks like silence. Armor that costs them intimacy every single time. Here's the heartbreaking part. Most avoidants know the exact moment when they should have apologized. They replay it in their head. They rehearse the words. They even whisper them to themselves. But when the time comes, fear strangles the words in their throat. And instead of releasing them, they swallow them whole. Those unsaid apologies become stones, heavy, sinking deeper with every relationship, until they're buried under the weight of all the words they never spoke. And yet, they still circle you. Have you noticed? The avoidant rarely vanishes completely. They may not text often, but when they do, it's sudden, out of nowhere, like they're checking if the bridge is still standing. That's guilt. That's longing. That's a quiet, "I'm sorry," wrapped in the disguise of casual curiosity. "Hey, how are you? Thought of you today. Remember that song we used to listen to?" On the surface, it looks harmless, but beneath it, it's their attempt to reconnect without facing the vulnerability of an apology. You might ask, do they even know how much they hurt me? Yes, they do, more than they'll admit. Because avoidants feel more than they show. They notice every tear, every sigh, every moment your eyes pull away. And even when they look distant, they're cataloging your pain. They're feeling it, but they don't know what to do with it. So instead of leaning in, they hide. Instead of mending, they retreat. It's not that they don't see, it's that they can't act. Here's what makes this so devastating for you. You didn't just want an apology. You wanted acknowledgement. You wanted to know your pain mattered, that your feelings weren't invisible. But every silence said the opposite. Every silence told you, you don't matter enough. And that message cuts deeper than the mistake itself. Because mistakes are human, but the refusal to repair, that feels cruel. And so you began to doubt, not just them, but yourself. You began to wonder if you were asking for too much, if maybe you were the problem, if maybe wanting an apology made you needy. But here's the truth. You weren't needy. You were human. Repair is not a luxury in love. It's the foundation of it. And the fact that you never got it wasn't proof that you asked for too much. It was proof that they gave too little. Now let's look at the cost. What happens when apologies are never spoken? Resentment grows. Walls rise. Distance hardens. You stop trusting. You stop opening. You stop believing repair is possible. And eventually, you stop reaching for them altogether. The very thing they feared most, losing you, becomes the outcome of their silence. Because love without repair is love on borrowed time. But here's something powerful to hold on to. The avoidant may never give you the words you craved, but that doesn't mean you'll never hear them in your life. Healthy love apologizes. Healthy love repairs. Healthy love says, I hurt you, and I see it. Let's mend this together. The absence of apology with the avoidant isn't the rule of relationships. It's the wound of theirs. And just because they couldn't meet you there, doesn't mean no one ever will. The avoidant's silence is their prison, but it doesn't have to be yours. You are free to walk toward people who know how to speak love out loud. People who understand that saying, I'm sorry, doesn't make them weak. It makes them worthy of trust. And maybe the real closure is realizing the apology you wanted was never about them. It was about your need to feel seen. And that need was always valid. So instead of waiting for silence to break, you break free from silence. You choose a life where repair is possible. And in doing so, you give yourself the one apology the avoidant never could. The apology that says, I'm sorry you had to wait so long for words. That should have come easily. You deserve better. And now, you'll have it. The silence of the avoidant apology isn't random. It's a pattern, a survival strategy, a rule they live by, even when it destroys the very bond they wanted to keep. Because for them, apologizing feels like exposure, not just to you, But to themselves, it means looking at their own behavior and facing the truth that they hurt the person they cared for. And if you've noticed, avoidants rarely sit with feelings that deep. They move away from them. They run toward distractions. They bury emotions under routine, work, hobbies, anything but facing the raw truth. Think about this for a moment. Apologies are small doorways into intimacy. They open space for vulnerability. They soften defenses. They say, I'm willing to put down my armor so you can see me human again. But for the avoidant, that doorway looks like a trap. Step through it, and they fear collapse. Because what if they apologize and you don't accept it? What if you use it to confirm their deepest fear? That they're not enough, that they always fail, that love will abandon them anyway? To them, silence feels safer than risking rejection, even if silence guarantees distance. This is why many avoidants rewrite the story. Instead of saying, I hurt you, they shift it inward. They tell themselves, you're too sensitive. You always overreact. You're impossible to please. It's not because they don't know the truth. It's because rewriting the story spares them from carrying the weight of fault. But here's the irony. That rewrite doesn't protect the relationship. It poisons it. Because while they're busy protecting their ego, they're wounding your heart. And every time they refuse to apologize, they're teaching you to distrust them, teaching you to pull back, teaching you to guard yourself in return. Let's imagine a moment. You've been waiting for hours after an argument. The room is heavy, your chest tight. You replay the fight in your head. All you want is for them to walk in and say, I know I was wrong. I'm sorry for shutting down. But instead, they wander into the room, act like nothing happened, and talk about something random. A movie, a piece of work, dinner plans. To you, it feels like gaslighting, like your pain was erased. But to them, that's their apology, not in words, but in action, in their mind, changing the subject, moving on, acting normal. That's their way of repairing. But to you, it's maddening, because repair without acknowledgement doesn't heal. It deepens the wound. This is the cruel mismatch between avoidance and their partners. You crave recognition. They crave escape. You want the wound to be named. They want the wound to disappear. So you end up speaking different languages of repair. And the relationship starts to feel like you're living on two separate islands. Your island is full of longing, waiting for words that never come. Their island is built on avoidance, where silence is safety and apologies feel like danger. But the distance between those islands is exactly where the love drowns. Now let's talk about what happens inside them. When they refuse to apologize, they tell themselves they've avoided conflict. That silence means peace. That moving on means strength. But underneath, the guilt festers. The shame gnaws. The unspoken words pile up until they begin to harden into regret. And here's something most avoidants won't admit. They think about apologizing long after the moment has passed. Lying in bed, driving alone, scrolling through old messages. They whisper apologies into the dark. Apologies no one hears. I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry I couldn't stay open. I'm sorry I made you feel small. But by then, it's too late to say them out loud. And so those apologies remain ghosts, haunting them, haunting the love they lost. This is where you come in, because living with an avoidant often means you've had to learn to read between the lines, to interpret silence as guilt, to translate avoidance into fear, to see the apology that never comes, and pretend it's enough. But pretending comes at a cost, because when you excuse silence as love, you slowly teach yourself to accept less than you deserve. You start to lower your bar for repair. You start to convince yourself That moving on without words is normal. But it isn't. It never was. Apologies matter. Repair matters. Acknowledgement matters. And you were never wrong for needing them. So what's the hidden truth? The apologies you never hear from the avoidant don't disappear into nothing. They stay lodged inside them. They leak out in subtle ways. A sudden check-in months later. A late-night message. A memory shared out of nowhere. That's the apology behind a mask. Not clean, not clear, but real in its own broken way. And yet, that doesn't mean you should settle for crumbs. Because here's the hard truth. You cannot build a future on apologies that live only in silence. Love without repair is love without growth. And love without growth always collapses under its own weight. What does this mean for you? It means you stop confusing silence with peace. It means you stop carrying the apology that was never yours to hold. It means you begin to see the truth, that their silence wasn't about your worth. It was about their fear. And that fear, no matter how strong, is not stronger than your need for love that repairs. So you release the waiting. You release the hope that one day they'll say the words. Because whether or not they do, you deserve repair right now. Not in whispers, not in silence, but in love that shows up and speaks the truth out loud. And maybe, just maybe, the most powerful apology in your life will not come from them. It will come from you. An apology to yourself for all the years you waited, for all the tears you justified, for all the times you believed silence meant love. You tell yourself, I'm sorry you had to carry that weight. I'm sorry you had to live in doubt. I'm sorry no one ever showed you. That real love does repair. And then you promise yourself, you'll never settle for less again. There comes a moment in every relationship with an avoidant when you finally realize the apology you're waiting for isn't coming. Not because you don't deserve it, not because they don't feel the guilt, but because their walls are taller than their words. And you stand there, heart open, hands empty, realizing love without repair is love without safety. This is where your story shifts, because you can't spend your whole life waiting for someone else to say the words that would set you free. Freedom begins when you stop waiting, when you see their silence for what it is, not a reflection of your worth, but a reflection of their fear. Think about it. If love is a bridge, apologies are the planks that hold it together. Without them, every fight takes a piece away. Every silence removes another board. Until one day, you look down, and there's nothing left to walk on. That's the cost of the apologies you never hear. And yet, here's the paradox. Avoidants often realize too late what their silence destroyed. They come back years later, not with the words you deserved then, but with confessions whispered in regret. I wish I had told you I was sorry. I didn't know how to love you the way you needed. I hope you know it was never you. But by then, you've already learned something vital. You can't live your life waiting for ghosts to speak. So what do you do instead? You reclaim your voice. You say the words to yourself that they could not say. You remind yourself, I was worthy of an apology. I was worthy of repair. I was worthy of love that could admit its mistakes. Because when you tell yourself this, you take back what their silence stole. You stop defining yourself by the words they withheld, and you start defining yourself by the truth you now know. But let's be honest, walking away from waiting isn't easy. Part of you still craves that one message, that one call, that one moment when they finally break. And sometimes they will. Sometimes the avoidant does reach out, years later, when the weight of silence is too heavy. But here's the question. Do you really want your healing to be postponed until then? Do you want your life on pause, waiting for words that may never come? Or do you want to begin now, living breathing, healing, without needing permission from their voice. Because here's the secret most people never tell you. Closure doesn't come from them. It comes from you. It comes the moment you realize you can accept what was never spoken and still set yourself free. It comes when you let go of their apology and give yourself the peace you've been waiting for. And here's something even more powerful. Every time you release the need for their apology, you create space for someone else. Someone who knows how to love differently. Someone who doesn't run from repair. Someone who doesn't see apologies as weakness. Someone who says, "I love you too much to leave this wound open." Because that kind of love exists, and it waits for people brave enough to stop clinging to silence. So what now? Now, you begin to choose differently. You choose not to explain away silence. You choose not to settle for emotional crumbs. You choose not to carry their unspoken words as proof you weren't enough. Instead, you stand tall in your own truth. You say, "I was always enough. I was always worthy of repair, and I will no longer live on islands of silence." If you've been here, if you've lived in the waiting, if you've begged your heart to survive on silence, know this: your story doesn't end here. It begins where you stop waiting. It begins when you breathe, release the weight, and step into a life where repair, love, and safety are not withheld, but freely given. And if this spoke to you, if it touched a place inside that knows the pain of silence, but also the hunger for freedom, stay here with me, because you don't have to walk this path alone. There are others like you, others healing, others learning that silence is not love, and that waiting is not living. Together, we can break the cycle. So take a moment now, subscribe, share this with someone who needs it, and let's keep walking this road of truth, of healing, of love that finally repairs, because you deserve it. You always did.